They mocked him, laughed as they shoved him into a jail cell. Just another black man who didn't belong. But the next morning, when those same racist cops walked into court, something was wrong. The crowd whispered. The air felt heavy. And then, they saw him. On a chilly evening that felt like any other, Judge Elijah Brooks, a figure usually seen robed and commanding from the elevated bench of his courtroom, found himself in a starkly different setting. Tonight, he was just a man in a suit, the formal attire from his family dinner still impeccable as he drove through the quiet streets toward his home. His evening had been pleasant, filled with laughter and conversation, a much-needed break from his duties. However, as he navigated the familiar route, the tranquility of the night was abruptly shattered. The flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror signaled an unexpected turn of events. He pulled over, his heart rate steady despite the sudden stop. Two police officers, Officer Blake and Officer Harris, approached his vehicle. The air was crisp, and their breath formed clouds in the cold night air as they neared. From the outset, it was clear this was no routine traffic stop. The officers, both white and visibly younger than Elijah, wore expressions that didn't match the professionalism expected of their uniforms. As they reached his window, their demeanor was not of inquiry, but of presumption. "Step out of the car, sir," Officer Blake demanded without a preamble, his tone harsh as if addressing a known felon rather than a law-abiding citizen. The request was phrased as an order, and it carried an undercurrent of threat that was impossible to ignore. Judge Brooks complied, stepping out with a calm he meticulously maintained. The evening's chill bit through his suit, but his composed facade never faltered. He handed over his ID when asked, the badge clearly identifying him as a judge, a detail that should have diffused the situation immediately. Yet, the officers either didn't notice or didn't care. They scoffed at the ID, dismissing it with a smirk that bordered on contempt. "You think this gets you special treatment?" Officer Harris sneered, his words laced with mockery as he took the ID and tossed it carelessly back into the car. The situation escalated quickly from there. Despite Elijah's compliance and clear lack of resistance, the officers handcuffed him, their grips unnecessarily tight, and shoved him into the back of the squad car. "Booking you for resisting arrest," Officer Blake stated flatly as he slammed the car door, sealing Elijah inside. The irony of the charge wasn't lost on him, given his complete cooperation. Inside the cramped space of the car, Elijah allowed himself a small smirk. He was calm, unnervingly so, a stark contrast to the usual reactions they likely encountered. He didn't argue or shout, he simply waited. Because Judge Elijah Brooks knew something the officers didn't. His career had been built on understanding the law, upholding justice, and navigating the intricate and sometimes murky waters of legal bureaucracy. He had faced discrimination before, had seen it cloaked in false civility and outright aggression. He knew the system, its flaws, and its powers. As the squad car pulled away from the curb, heading toward the station, Elijah's smirk widened just slightly. Because he knew exactly what was coming next. As dawn broke over the city, the courthouse began to hum with the usual weekday activity. Officers Blake and Harris, feeling particularly self-assured after their shift, strolled through the marble-floored hallways of the courthouse. They were in high spirits, animatedly discussing the previous night's events with a camaraderie that bordered on prideful glee. "Did you see the look on that thug's face when we cuffed him?" Officer Blake chuckled, replaying the arrest in his head with a sense of satisfaction. They recounted their version of the events, embellishing details to paint themselves as heroes in a dangerous encounter. "Yeah, another one off the streets," Officer Harris responded, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of passing attorneys and clerks. Their conversation, filled with unchecked bravado, echoed off the walls, a stark contrast to the solemnity that typically pervaded the space. Unbeknownst to them, their casual dismissal of the gravity of their actions and the flippant reduction of a respected judge to a mere thug was overheard by several courthouse regulars, who exchanged uneasy glances but remained silent. Officer Blake and Officer Harris continued, oblivious to the growing discomfort around them. Their laughter still hung in the air as they entered the courtroom, expecting another routine hearing. They anticipated quick proceedings, perhaps a commendation for their diligence the night before. The room filled gradually with lawyers, defendants, and spectators, the murmur of voices blending into a typical morning chorus. Then, the moment that shifted the day's trajectory arrived with the simple, routine announcement from the bailiff. All rise for the Honorable Judge Elijah Brooks. The courtroom complied in unison, the collective movement a practiced ritual. Officers Blake and Harris, still caught in their banter, turned toward the bench, expecting to face any judge but the one they had arrested the night before. The blood drained from Officer Harris's face as he stumbled back a step, his balance faltering as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Officer Blake's initial reaction was one of disbelief, his whispered expletive a breach of courtroom decorum that earned a sharp rebuke from a nearby bailiff. Silence fell like a curtain, heavy and absolute, as Judge Brooks entered. His presence commanded the room, his judicial robes lending him an air of gravitas that contrasted sharply with the casual disdain the officers had shown hours earlier. The judge's gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of those assembled before it settled on the two officers standing, now visibly shaken, in the well of the court. "Well, well. Look who we have here." Judge Brooks finally spoke, his voice calm but laden with an unspoken weight. The courtroom held its collective breath, the air thick with anticipation and the undercurrents of impending justice. Judge Brooks took his seat, the authority of his position and his personal integrity merging in that moment. The morning's docket promised routine legal proceedings, but for Officers Blake and Harris, the stakes were suddenly personal and professionally perilous. The judge's opening remarks were brief but pointed. "This court stands as a beacon of justice, equity, and the rule of law," he stated, his eyes briefly meeting those of the discomfited officers. "Today, we will proceed with our scheduled cases, but let us all be reminded of the weight and sanctity of the responsibilities we bear in our respective roles." As the hearings began, the usual legal exchanges resumed, but under the surface ran a current of profound re-evaluation, particularly for Officers Blake and Harris. Every case Judge Brooks presided over that day was handled with his characteristic fairness, yet the officers could not help but feel the scrutiny of every legal statute discussed, every right upheld, as a personal indictment of their actions the night before. The proceedings served not just as a fulfillment of legal duty, but as a lesson in humility and accountability for the officers who had so grievously misjudged the man on the bench before them. Judge Brooks, for his part, maintained his professionalism throughout, but the gravity of the day's lessons was not lost on anyone in the courtroom, least of all the two officers who had walked in expecting commendation and found themselves instead confronting the consequences of their arrogance and mistake. In the hushed courtroom, the tension mounted palpably as Officers Blake and Harris, now standing as defendants in their own right, scrambled to justify their actions from the previous night. Their initial confidence had dissipated, replaced by a growing realization of the gravity of their situation. "We didn't recognize him," Officer Blake stammered, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "It was a misunderstanding." Officer Harris nodded vigorously in agreement, his eyes darting around the room, seeking an ally or a sympathetic ear. Judge Elijah Brooks, sitting high on the bench, looked down at them, his expression unreadable. The courtroom was silent, the audience hanging on every word. Then, in a voice icy with disdain, the judge addressed their feeble excuse. "Oh, so it's okay to treat a black man like garbage unless he's someone important?" His rhetorical question echoed in the courtroom, underscoring the officers' prejudice and the flawed logic of their defense. The officers' faces flushed red as they fumbled for a response, their anxiety palpable. Before they could formulate their thoughts into coherent sentences, Judge Brooks made a move that no one anticipated. He signaled to the court technician, who wheeled out a monitor usually reserved for presenting evidence to the jury. "Let's examine the facts," Judge Brooks announced, his tone suggesting that he was about to shift the dynamics of power within the courtroom dramatically. He then revealed that he had requested the body cam footage from the officers' uniforms to be reviewed as part of the evidence for this hearing. The courtroom fell into a deeper silence, the air thick with anticipation. The judge nodded to the technician, who pressed play. The video that unfolded on the screen was damning. It captured every detail of the encounter from the officers' perspective, including their mocking tones and inappropriate comments. The audio was crystal clear, the officers' voices heard insulting and threatening Judge Brooks, oblivious to his identity and the recording devices capturing their misconduct. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the footage played. Jurors exchanged shocked glances, and lawyers shook their heads in disbelief, their professional facades momentarily slipping in the face of such blatant unprofessionalism and disrespect. As the playback continued, showing the officers' escalating hostility and unprovoked aggression, the implications of their actions started to sink in. Officer Blake and Officer Harris watched, pale and sweating, as their own words and behaviors were laid bare for all to see. It was a striking reversal of roles. The accusers had become the accused, their own misconduct serving as the most compelling evidence against them. The footage finally ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Judge Brooks turned his gaze back to the officers, his expression stern and authoritative. This video speaks volumes, not only about the conduct of some officers, but about the systemic issues we still face in law enforcement, he stated, addressing not only the courtroom but a broader audience, as the proceedings were being recorded for judicial review. He continued, "It is not enough to wear the badge. You must embody the principles of justice, fairness, and respect that it represents." His words were a reminder of the responsibilities that came with positions of power and the potential consequences of abusing that power. The officers stood, chastened and visibly shaken, as the judge prepared to deliver his judgment. Their careers, their reputations, and their futures were hanging in the balance, undermined by their own actions and now subject to the very system of justice they were supposed to uphold. In that moment, the courtroom served as a microcosm of broader societal issues. Issues of racism, abuse of power, and the need for accountability at all levels of law enforcement. Judge Brooks, once the victim of their misconduct, was now the arbiter of their fate, a role he assumed with a deep sense of duty and a commitment to ensuring that justice was served. In the highly charged atmosphere of the courtroom, Judge Elijah Brooks presided with an air of composed professionalism. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, a resolute determination was palpable, especially as he turned his focus towards the prosecution. His voice, though steady, carried an undercurrent of severity that underscored the gravity of the situation. "I assume we're pressing charges against these officers?" he asked, his gaze piercing through the courtroom's tension. The query seemed to reverberate through the room, landing squarely on Officers Blake and Harris, who stood flanked by their bewildered attorney. The implications of the judge's words struck them like a physical blow, shock registering visibly on their faces as the reality of their predicament sank in. Officer Blake, his voice tinged with desperation and disbelief, blurted out, "You can't be serious. You can't do this." His outburst, a mix of panic and outrage, echoed off the courtroom walls, drawing a sharp look from the judge. Judge Brooks, maintaining his judicial demeanor, allowed a small smile to break through, not of amusement, but of ironclad assurance. "Oh, I can, and I will," he responded with unyielding resolve. His statement was not just a retort. It was a declaration of his commitment to justice, underscoring that no one was above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it. The charge was laid out clearly and decisively: false arrest, racial profiling, and abuse of power. These were serious allegations that not only jeopardized the officers' careers, but also marked them as perpetrators of the very crimes they were supposed to prevent. The prosecutor, following Judge Brooks' lead, proceeded with formalizing the charges, ensuring that the legal proceedings were meticulous and by the book. As the charges were read aloud, the same courtroom that Officers Blake and Harris had entered with smug confidence now turned into an arena of accountability. The roles had dramatically reversed. The observers, some of whom might have initially sympathized with the officers based on their badges alone, now viewed them through the lens of their actions now deemed criminal by the law. The impact on the officers was immediate and devastating. The realization that their careers in law enforcement were effectively over sunk in as they listened to the list of charges. Their previous encounters, their years of service, and their expectations of a quiet resolution all evaporated under the weight of Judge Brooks' authoritative voice. Judge Brooks, addressing the courtroom, spoke of the broader implications of the case. "Let this be a reminder that justice does not discriminate. It does not falter based on badge or status. Everyone, regardless of their role or position, is accountable to the law, he stated, his voice resolute and clear. The courtroom, filled with journalists, law students, and citizens, was rapt. They witnessed not just a fall from grace, but a reaffirmation of judicial integrity. The case, undoubtedly, would become a touchstone for discussions on police conduct, racial bias in law enforcement, and the judicial system's role in upholding civil rights. As officers Blake and Harris were led away, their handcuffs a stark symbol of their new status as defendants, the courtroom buzzed with a sobering energy. The case was more than just about the fall of two police officers. It was a visible shift in societal norms and expectations. It was about holding power accountable and ensuring that those who wielded it did so with respect for all citizens, irrespective of race. Judge Brooks, his part played with a meticulous adherence to justice, watched as the officers exited. His face was impassive, but there was a light in his eyes, a reflection of the steadfast belief in the law he served. This case would resonate beyond today, serving as a potent example of the consequences when those entrusted with power abuse it. The gavel struck, the sound crisp in the now silent room. The session adjourned, but the reverberations of this day's events would echo long into the future, in legal circles, in police precincts, and in communities across the nation. In the intense atmosphere of the courtroom, as the trial of officers Blake and Harris drew to a close, the tension was palpable. After the damning evidence was presented, and Judge Elijah Brooks had made his final remarks, the case was handed over to the jury. The courtroom waited in bated breath, but the jury needed little time to deliberate, a testament to the overwhelming impact of the body cam footage and the judge's compelling summation. The foreman rose, his expression solemn as he delivered the verdict that would resonate through the community and beyond. "Guilty," he declared, his voice echoing in the now silent courtroom. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with implication. At the announcement, the courtroom erupted into a cacophony of reactions. There were gasps from some, tears from others, and a palpable sense of relief from those who had followed the case with heavy hearts. The verdict wasn't just a declaration of guilt. It was a vindication of the justice system's ability to hold everyone accountable, regardless of their position. Officers Blake and Harris, standing stiffly, their faces drained of color, could only watch in disbelief as the immediate consequences of their actions unfolded before them. They were approached by court officers, who solemnly but firmly took their badges and handcuffed them. This moment, performed under the gaze of Judge Brooks and a packed courtroom, symbolized the end of their careers in law enforcement, a stark departure from the authority they once wielded. Judge Brooks, who had presided over the trial with a mix of stern professionalism and an unmistakable commitment to justice, finally stood. He looked directly at the now disgraced officers, his gaze unwavering. "Now you understand what it feels like to be judged unfairly," he stated, his voice resonant and clear. This statement, while reflecting on the irony of their situation, also underscored a deeper message about empathy and justice. The judge's words struck a chord, not just with those in the room, but with the broader public following the case. His leadership in the trial had not only guided it to a just conclusion, but it also sparked a wider discussion on issues of police conduct, racial profiling, and the responsibilities of those who wield power. As the officers were led away, the courtroom began to clear, but the impact of the trial lingered. Legal analysts and news reporters crowded outside, broadcasting live updates and delving into the implications of the verdict. In homes, in offices, and on the streets, people discussed the outcome, many feeling a renewed faith in a system that had so publicly corrected its own. In the weeks following the verdict, Judge Brooks received commendations from colleagues and civic leaders. His handling of such a high-profile case with grace and authority was seen as a beacon of judicial integrity. Meanwhile, the police department faced scrutiny and was prompted to review its training and oversight procedures to prevent such incidents in the future. For the community, the trial and its outcome were a catalyst for dialogue and action. Meetings were held, forums were organized, and policies were debated, all with the goal of fostering a more just and equitable society. The case of officers Blake and Harris, while a stark reminder of the challenges that still existed, also exemplified the potential for progress and accountability. In the quieter moments, Judge Brooks reflected on the case and its broader implications. He knew that while the trial was over, the work to ensure fairness and justice for all was ongoing. Each verdict, each decision he made from the bench, was part of a larger narrative of justice, one that he was committed to shaping with fairness and wisdom. As Judge Elijah Brooks exited the courthouse, a swarm of reporters awaited him, their microphones poised and cameras flashing. The air buzzed with the electric aftermath of one of the most dramatic and consequential trials the city had ever seen. Among the clamor, a journalist managed to catch the judge's attention with a pointed question that captured the essence of the public's sentiment. "How does it feel to take down two racist cops?" Judge Brooks paused, the corners of his mouth turning up into a knowing smile. His response was calm yet powerful. "I didn't take them down. Their own actions did." This simple statement resonated deeply, reflecting his long-held belief that justice is a natural consequence of one's actions within the legal and moral frameworks of society. The case quickly went viral, becoming a touchstone for discussions about justice, accountability, and reform. National headlines branded the trial as the most satisfying courtroom moment ever, capturing the collective relief and satisfaction felt by many across the country. Social media platforms erupted with discussions, debates, and commendations for Judge Brooks's handling of the trial, turning him into an emblematic figure of judicial integrity and the fight against systemic racism. Back at the police department, the reverberations of the trial's outcome forced a reckoning with long-standing issues. Under intense public scrutiny and the weight of undeniable evidence from the trial, the department had no choice but to introduce sweeping new policies on racial profiling and police conduct. Training programs were overhauled, and oversight mechanisms were strengthened to ensure that the errors of the past would not be repeated. These changes were met with a mixture of resistance and relief within the ranks, but marked a significant step forward in reforming practices that had long been criticized. Judge Brooks, whose career had been defined by a steadfast commitment to justice, saw the trial not as an endpoint, but as a catalyst for ongoing change. In the weeks and months that followed, he worked tirelessly with community leaders, legal experts, and law enforcement officials to build on the momentum created by the trial. His efforts were focused on ensuring that the principles of fairness and justice were not confined to his courtroom, but were part of a broader cultural shift within the judicial system. His dedication extended beyond professional obligations. He engaged in public speaking, participated in community forums, and contributed to educational initiatives aimed at promoting legal literacy and understanding among the public. Each step he took was driven by the conviction that informed citizens are empowered citizens, capable of holding their institutions accountable. As the story of the trial continued to unfold in the media, Judge Brooks maintained his humble approach, often deflecting praise onto the broader legal system and the cooperative efforts of countless individuals who strive daily to uphold justice. However, his role as a decisive moral anchor in a tumultuous sea of social and legal challenges was undeniable. Years later, the trial of Officers Blake and Harris remained a defining moment in Judge Brooks's career and a pivotal point in the community's history. It served as a powerful reminder that justice is not an abstract concept, but a tangible, achievable reality when courage, integrity, and the rule of law prevail.